The train hissed like a snake in the sun, slowing to a halt on the dry wooden tracks of Elk Pass. Dust rose in lazy spirals. People watched the platform. Most were waiting on freight, but one man was waiting on a promise. Emmett Coulter stood stiff-backed under the depot awning, a worn hat in one hand, a folded letter in the other. He'd read the letter enough times to know it by heart. Sweet, thoughtful, written by a woman who called herself Tessie May. She'd be arriving on the morning train from Kansas City. She was to be his wife. When the door of the passenger car opened, a woman stepped down. Brown dress, travel wrinkled, one satchel, no gloves. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not nervously, but with steady quiet. When their eyes met, Emmett almost forgot to breathe. But then she smiled at him, not a nervous smile, but a sure one, and walked straight up. "You must be Emmett," she said softly. He nodded, and for a brief moment, it felt like the letters had come to life. But what Emmett didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that those letters hadn't come from her. Not really. The preacher mumbled through the vows like he was late for supper. A dry wind tugged at the hem of Tessie's skirt as she stood beside Emmett on the porch of the Elk Pass Church, hand in hand with a man she'd only just met. Around them, a few townsfolk gathered out of curiosity rather than celebration. Tessie's hair had loosened in the wind, but she didn't reach to fix it. Her eyes stayed fixed on Emmett, who hadn't looked at her since they'd climbed the steps. His jaw was set, his gaze distant. "You may now kiss the bride," the preacher said. Emmett didn't. He gave a small nod, turned to the crowd and tipped his hat. "Thank you," he said flatly. Then to Tessie, "Let's go." They rode to the homestead in silence. The trail was narrow, the land dry and wide. Every so often, Tessie stole a glance at him. His hands were calloused. He rode like someone who knew the weight of hard work, but there was no warmth in him. Not yet. The house was a low-slung ranch style, a porch with a broken step and a field that stretched toward the hills. One cow, 2 chickens, no flowers, no welcome. "You can sleep in the front room for now," Emmett said, helping her off the wagon. "There's stew on the stove if you're hungry." He was already halfway to the house before she could open her mouth. She stepped inside, her boots echoing on the wood floor. The room smelled of ash and iron. A pot simmered on the stove. A cot had been set up with clean sheets. There was a Bible on the table and a stack of letters tied with twine. She walked to the letters, fingers hovering. Her throat tightened. She couldn't read them, not a word. That night, Tessie lay awake listening to coyotes howl in the hills. The bed creaked when she shifted. Somewhere in the house, Emmett moved. A door closed softly. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what the letters had said, the ones that made her come here. But of course, she hadn't read them herself. Miss Adeline had, back at the boarding house in Kansas City, a school teacher between jobs, kind-hearted and bored enough to help a laundress dream of something better. "She sounds serious," Miss Adeline had said, voice soft as she read the first letter aloud. "He's a widower, hard-working, wants a partner, not just a wife. Someone honest, good with animals. Says he wants to build something real." Something real, that was enough for Tessie. She rolled onto her side and whispered to the dark, "I want that too." The next morning she rose early, washed up in the basin, braided her hair, boiled water for coffee. She stepped outside to find Emmett already in the yard, mending a fence post. She walked over, offering a tin cup of coffee. "Morning," she said. He took the cup but didn't smile. "We've got calves due this week. You'll need to stay close to the house." Tessie nodded. "I'll leave you a list of chores inside. I don't expect much, just what you can do." She waited, but he turned back to his work. Inside, she found a scrap of paper on the kitchen table. A list in small block letters. Chores, sweep porch, feed chickens, wash linens, heat water for bath. She stared at the letters, her chest hollowing. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper. She recognized a few shapes from signs and canned goods, but the words didn't speak to her, so she guessed. By noon, she had swept the porch twice. The chickens were pecking contentedly. The linens had been dunked in boiled water, then strung across a sagging rope line behind the barn. She sat on the porch step, dirt on her skirt and sweat on her neck. Her hands ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from doing something that might matter. When Emmett came back from the pasture, he glanced around. You didn't boil enough water, he said, frowning at the half-washed linens. And you fed the chickens oats instead of mash. Wasteful. Tessie opened her mouth, then closed it. He didn't wait, just walked inside and let the screen door slam behind him. She stayed where she was, hands clenched in her lap. That evening, she tried again. I could make cornbread tomorrow, she said as he spooned stew into his bowl. If you've got cornmeal? He shrugged. Pantry's labeled. She stopped. He looked up. What? She steadied her breath. Nothing. I'll figure it out. He just nodded once. Conversation closed. Just returned to eating. The silence between them was not cruel, just wide. The next morning, Tessie didn't wait for a list. She followed her instinct. She cleaned the barn, not because it was on a list, but because the smell had bothered her. She scrubbed the water trough. She noticed one of the hens limping and gently wrapped its leg with cloth from her sewing kit. She sang under her breath as she worked. Emmett watched her from the window unseen. That night she was quiet at dinner, but her face had color from the sun, and her fingers bore tiny blisters. You fixed the coop door, he said flatly. She nodded. Wasn't latching. He chewed, swallowed. Smart of you. She looked up surprised. Their eyes met for half a breath too long. Later, when Emmett was outside finishing chores, Tessie sat on the front steps and pulled the twine from the bundle of old letters. She held one up, letting the ink catch the dying light. It might have said anything. A confession, a promise, a lie. She didn't know, but she pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. The house was quiet in the mornings, the kind of quiet that didn't invite conversation. Emmett rose before dawn, made coffee without speaking, and left for the fields with only the sound of his boots on the floor to mark his passing. Tessie didn't mind the silence. She'd grown up around men who used noise to dominate a room. Slam doors, bark orders, laugh too loudly. Emmett's silence felt more like a wall. But walls, she knew, could be leaned against, sometimes even climbed. She began to shape her day without instructions. She didn't touch the pantry labels anymore. Instead, she learned by watching. One afternoon, she followed Emmett to town to buy feed. While he spoke to the storekeep, Tessie wandered the aisles, running her fingers across burlap sacks, tins, and flour bags, whispering the letters to herself. Later that night, she tried to copy them into the dust on the windowsill. C-O-R-N. Was that cornmeal? Or cornstarch? She didn't know, but she tried again. 3 days after the wedding, Emmett said it plain. You can't read, can you? Tessie was scrubbing the hearth, her knees dirty, back bent. She kept her gaze on the ash like the words didn't touch her. No, she said simply. There was a long pause. Then he grunted. This house is a partnership, he said. Not charity. I need someone who can carry weight. I know, she said, still scrubbing. You can't run a house if you don't know the difference between vinegar and turpentine. I know that too, she said, and finally stood. He looked at her, really looked. She wasn't embarrassed, wasn't crying. She was just steady. I may not know your letters, she said, but I know animals. I know people, and I know work. He stared a moment longer, then turned away. Suit yourself, he muttered. That evening, Tessie didn't eat with him. She sat outside on the steps, a blanket over her lap, watching the clouds turn copper. A faint shuffle came from the yard. She turned and saw a small girl, blonde, barefoot, no more than 6, peeking through the fence. Well, hello, Tessie said gently. The girl didn't run. She stepped closer. I'm Mabel, the girl said. You're the new lady. I suppose I am. Do you know stories? Mabel asked. Tessie tilted her head. I might. Can you tell one? So she did. By the end of the week, there were 5 children at the fence by sunset. They came dusty with scraped knees and half-eaten apples, settling on the porch steps like chicks around a lamp. Tessie told stories, sometimes funny, sometimes sad, always strange. There was one about a horse with one white eye that could outrun thunder, and another about a woman who carried the wind in her apron and could hush a tornado with a whisper. And there was one Emmett heard from inside about a man who couldn't hear music until someone showed him how to close his eyes. That story lingered in his ears. Saturday night, Emmett returned late from town. He walked past the porch, paused, and turned around. Tessie was out front again, with 3 children snuggled close, her voice low. She told him, "You don't need to understand the song," Tessie was saying. "Just feel how it moves." And when he closed his eyes, he finally danced. One of the girls laughed, clapping her hands. Emmett didn't move. Then one of the boys asked, "Was he real, Miss Tessie?" She smiled. "They're all real. You just have to know how to listen." He watched the firelight in her eyes and felt something crack inside his chest. The next morning, he found her near the barn, shoveling hay. "Where'd you learn to tell stories like that?" he asked. She blinked. "My papa. He couldn't read neither, but he could spin a tale like silk." "I heard one about a deaf man and a dance," Emmett said. Tessie gave a half smile. "That one's just bones. Needs more meat?" He tilted his head. "Was it about someone?" She wiped her brow with her sleeve. "Aren't they all?" The day warmed, and so did something between them. He brought her a new pail, reinforced the line where she dried her wash. Didn't say much, but his silence had changed shape. It no longer pushed her away. It left room. That night he found her staring at the tied bundle of letters again. "You want me to read you one?" he asked. She looked up. "No," she said quietly. He raised a brow. "I already heard them," in Miss Adeline's voice. "I'd rather forget what I thought they meant." He nodded slowly. "All right, then." He stayed where he was, the letter in his hands like a stone. He sat across from her, pulled out one letter, and read it anyway. Not aloud, just to himself. She watched his lips move, the crease in his brow, the way he paused over certain lines. And when he looked up, she was still staring. "I didn't write these," he admitted. She held his eyes steady as steel. "I know," he swallowed. "I thought I could love the woman in those letters," and he said, "but I didn't expect—" He stopped. "Didn't expect what?" she asked. "That the real woman might be better." That night, Tessie lay awake again, but not from fear or loneliness. She was listening, and in the room beyond hers, Emmett stirred too. Not sleeping, maybe listening as well. It started with the chickens. One morning, Emmett noticed they were laying more eggs. Not just more, cleaner too. He checked the nesting boxes, found new straw, a strip of cloth hung to shade the corner, even a few mint sprigs tucked near the feed trough. "Why mint?" he asked, crouching beside Tessie as she scattered grain. "Smells keep the snakes away," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "And the hens like it." He grunted. "Didn't know that." She didn't say, "I know." She just smiled, and the smile didn't ask for praise. That was the thing with Tessie. She didn't perform for attention. She simply did. A week later, the town's school marm stopped by, Miss Adeline, the very one who'd read Tessie all those letters back in Kansas City. She was visiting her aunt out in Elk Pass, and when she spotted Tessie at the general store, she nearly dropped her parcel. "Tessie May?" Tessie turned slowly, her cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. Adeline took her hands. "Well, I'll be. I prayed you'd find your way." "I found something," Tessie said softly. "Not sure what to call it yet." When Emmett came out of the store and saw them talking, he stopped mid-step. Adeline gave him a long, unreadable look. "So, you're Emmett Coulter," she said. He nodded. "That's right." She handed him her card. "If your wife ever wants to learn her letters, send word. I'll make time." Then she was gone. They didn't speak of it on the wagon ride home. But that night, Emmett watched Tessie take the card from her apron and place it in a tin box on the mantel. Not the trash, not her pocket, somewhere in between. Days passed. The porch became a stage. Every afternoon, like clockwork, children came. Tessie's voice rose and fell with rhythm and color, and her stories wrapped around the yard like smoke from a cook fire. Emmett found himself lingering nearby, sometimes mending a saddle strap, sometimes sharpening a tool, but always listening. And what he heard made something shift in him, because the stories weren't just fairy tales. They were portraits. One was about a stallion that wouldn't let anyone ride, until a girl who didn't speak laid her hand on its neck and just waited. Another was about a man who lived in a tower built from all the letters he'd never sent. The tower kept him safe, but also alone. until a wind came and scattered every page across the prairie. And then there was one that stopped him cold. She told it on a quiet evening. Only 3 children there, the sun burning low. There once was a boy, she began, who lived with a man who never said much. The boy learned not to ask questions, learned to work hard, to be still. But inside he held so many words, he just didn't know what to do with them. Emmett leaned against the barn wall, breath caught in his throat. The boy grew into a man, Tessie continued, and still he didn't speak much. He thought the quiet kept things simple, safe. But one day someone came who didn't care that he didn't speak. She talked enough for 2 and listened enough for 10. One of the little girls giggled. And when she told him a story, Tessie said, her voice lowering, he finally realized he didn't need to be silent to be strong. He could speak, or not, but he didn't have to be alone. The last line hovered, and Emmett felt like she'd peeled something off his skin. Later he asked her, "Was that story about me?" She met his gaze, then smiled. "Was it?" That night, after she fell asleep, Emmett sat by the fire and unfolded one of the old letters. He read the lines again, trying to match them to the woman in the next room. They didn't match. The woman in the letters had soft words, quiet doubts, questions about prairie life and cattle feed. The woman in the next room told stories that made children lean forward, that made grown men swallow hard. The woman in the letters didn't exist. But Tessie May, she was more than ink ever could have held. The next day he found her in the garden, planting wildflowers in a crooked line along the fence. "No pattern?" he asked. "They'll grow how they choose," she said. "Might as well give them the room." He crouched beside her. "You ever think about learning? Your letters, I mean." She scooped a bit more dirt over the roots. "I do. Why haven't you asked me?" She looked at him. "Because you didn't ask if I wanted to." He blinked. "You're right." A beat passed. "I'd like to learn," she said then, "but only if you'll let me teach you something too." He smiled. "What could I possibly learn from someone who doesn't read?" Tessie patted the earth and stood. "How to listen," she said. "Not with your ears, with your heart." That evening, Tessie told no stories. Instead, she handed Emmett a bucket and said, "We're going to the creek." They walked in silence. The sun set low, the sky purple as a bruise. Water lapped at the rocks. "Sit," she said, motioning to a flat stone. He obeyed. Then she sat beside him, pulled off her boots, and dipped her feet in. "You hear that?" she asked. He tilted his head. "Crickets, river stones, the wind. All I hear is noise." "No," she said softly. "It's not noise. It's story. Just not in words." He looked at her. "What's it saying?" She closed her eyes. "It's saying, don't rush. Let things find their shape." That night, Emmett didn't read a letter. He told one, faltering, awkward, but his voice still. "I was 12, he began, when my father died. Left me the land and nothing else. I learned quick how to keep the barn standing. I knew how to keep a barn up, but not much beyond that." Tessie listened, silent. He kept talking. About winters so cold his breath turned white inside the house. About a brother who left and never wrote. About how he'd once thought he'd never be enough for anyone. And when he finished, Tessie said just one thing. "You are." Rain came on a Tuesday, hard and sudden, like a door slammed by the sky. Emmett stood in the doorway, watching sheets of water wash over the fence posts. Tessie was in the kitchen, humming to herself while she scrubbed potatoes. The children wouldn't come that day, not with the road turned to soup. For once, the house felt like a shelter, like a place where something might grow. "Storm will pass quick," Emmett said. Tessie looked over her shoulder and smiled. "Let it take its time." He liked when she said things like that, simple words that held something deeper. Like her stories, they always seemed to mean more than they said. Later that afternoon, the rain still falling soft, Emmett rode into town. He hadn't meant to stop by the schoolhouse, but his boots led him there anyway. Adeline was there, of course. She looked up from her papers when she saw him, her pen pausing mid-stroke. "She's doing well," Emmett said before she could ask. "I imagine she is," Adeline said calmly. "She always had more in her than people gave her credit for." There was silence between them. Rain tapped the windows. "She's not just holding up the house," Emmett said after a while. "She's holding me up too." Adeline nodded once. "Then maybe it's time you told her." He hesitated. "She's proud." "She's earned the right to be," Adeline replied. Then gently, "So have you." Before he left, Adeline handed him a thin book. "Primer," she said. "Simple words, big letters. If she's ready, this is a good start." He looked down at it like it might burn his hands, then tucked it into his coat without a word. Back at the homestead, he found Tessie brushing the mare in the barn, her fingers gentle, her lips moving in a quiet song. "I brought something," he said, holding out the book. She turned, looked at the cover, then back at him. "I don't need to read to stay here," she said, not defensive, just certain. "I know," he said. "It's not about staying, it's about wanting more." She hesitated. "Do you want me to read?" "I want you to have whatever you want. That's different." Her gaze lingered on him. Finally, she reached out and took the book. "I'll start with the letters," she said. "One at a time." He nodded. "I'll help you, but only if you help me back." "With what?" He swallowed. "With speaking. Real things. Not just work talk." Her smile was soft, almost shy. "Deal." The days that followed were quiet but full. In the evenings, Tessie would trace letters on the table dust or in flour spread thin on a board. "C is for corn," she'd whisper. "M is for mare. E is for—" She'd glance at him, smirking. "Emmett." He'd roll his eyes but couldn't quite hide the warmth blooming in his chest. Sometimes when he was brave, he'd tell her about his mother, how she died too early, leaving only a silver hairbrush and a yellow quilt. Or about the year the well ran dry, and he had to beg water from a neighbor he hated. She never interrupted, just listened. And sometimes she told stories too, but not in the way of lessons or amusement. She told them like truths wrapped in ribbon, careful, precious things. One night after she read her first full sentence from the primer, she held the book in her lap and asked, "Do you remember the first letter I sent you?" Emmett chuckled. "I remember the one I thought was from you." "What did it say?" He leaned back. "Said you wanted someone strong, someone honest, someone who wouldn't mind if the house was quiet, so long as it wasn't empty." Tessie's eyes dropped to her hands. "I said that?" He smiled. "You didn't, but it turned out to be true anyway." Days grew longer. The chickens clucked louder. The fields sprouted green under the rain's blessing. Emmett fixed the fence posts that had waited too long. Tessie mended the curtains and let in more light. But something still lingered between them, a weight that hadn't quite lifted. One afternoon, Emmett found her outside, pulling weeds along the edge of the garden. He crouched beside her, fidgeting with a bit of root. "I need to tell you something." She looked up, dirt smudged on her cheek. "I didn't write the letters," he said. "I paid someone to do it, a shopkeeper's wife. I told her what to say, but the words weren't mine." "Not really." Tessie was quiet. "I figured no one would answer if I wrote the truth, that I was plain, that I didn't know what to say, that I wasn't enough." She brushed the dirt from her fingers, then placed her hand over his. "I didn't come for the letters," she said. "I came because I was tired of waiting for life to choose me." Emmett's throat tightened. "And did you find it?" "Life?" She smiled. "I found this. You, me, us." That night he handed her one of the old letters. "Tell me what it says," he said. She blinked. "You know I still can't read it." "I don't want you to read the word," he said softly. "I want you to tell me what you think it says." She took it gently, looked at the page for a long moment, then placed her hand over it and said, "Tell me what it says in your voice, not the inks." Emmett took a breath, closed his eyes, and began. The porch became their classroom. Each morning after chores, Tessie and Emmett sat side by side on the steps with the primer open between them. He would read aloud, slowly, carefully. She would trace letters with her fingertip, then try to form the sounds with her lips. "Buh," she said, pointing. "B?" He nodded. "That's right. Like barn." She grinned. "Or brave." He glanced sideways. "That too." Sometimes when the heat rose early, They moved to the shade of the barn. The horses listened in quiet approval. Emmett would write simple words in chalk on a worn plank. Tessie would copy them with care. Her hands were more used to flour and fabric than letters, but she worked slow and steady, like she did everything. She never asked for help twice. She never apologized for not knowing. That was Emmett's favorite part. In return, she gave him lessons of her own, though hers came without books. One day, as they walked the edge of the pasture, Tessie pointed at the sky. "See that line of birds?" she asked. He nodded. "They're not just flying, they're deciding. That lead bird, he won't stay in front forever. They take turns." "Huh," he muttered. "They listen to each other. That's how they know when to turn." Emmett stared for a long moment, watching the silent shift in the V-shaped line. "I've never seen that," he said. "You never looked?" she replied. Evenings changed too. They ate at the same table now, across from one another. Emmett no longer slurped stew and stood to leave. He lingered, asked questions. "How'd your papa tell you stories?" From his chair, smoking a pipe he never lit. He'd talk real slow, like the world was listening. Emmett smiled. "Maybe it was." One night, they sat on the porch long after the lantern had burned low. "I used to think silence was safe," he said. "No mistakes in silence. No shame." Tessie tilted her head. "I kept the world out by keeping my mouth shut," he added. She waited. "But you—" He paused, searching. "You made silence feel like something shared, not something that shuts you in." She reached for his hand and held it. They didn't need more words. 2 weeks later, a boy from town brought a telegram to the ranch. Tessie met him at the gate. The message was from the railway office. A box had arrived in Tessie's name. Emmett helped her hitch the wagon. The ride into town was dusty and slow, but full of gentle chatter. She asked him about the best soil for tomatoes. He asked her about the way she tied her hair, loose with a ribbon that always caught the wind. At the depot, a wooden crate waited. Inside, old quilts, a worn shawl, a tin of keepsakes, and a bundle of papers. Letters, mismatched, faded, edges curled. Some were Emmett's, some were her father's. "You want me to read them to you?" Emmett asked softly. Tessie shook her head. "Not yet." That night, she laid the bundle on the table and just stared at it. Emmett lit the lantern, then poured them each a mug of cider. She unwrapped one envelope, ran her fingers over the ink. "I remember this one," she said. "Papa wrote it the day Mama died. He didn't know how to say goodbye, so he wrote to her instead." She held the page close. He never learned to send it. "Do you want to know what it says?" I already do." The next morning, something changed in Tessie's routine. She took the Premier and a notebook out to the porch alone. By the time Emmett returned from mending a fence, she was copying full sentences. "What's that one say?" he asked. She grinned. "The horse is brown." He crouched beside her. "Ain't true, ours is chestnut." She laughed. "Still counts." Then quietly, "I want to write one, someday." "A story?" "No," she said. "A letter." "To who?" She looked at him. "To you." He looked down, throat tight. "I'd like that." That evening, the stories curled up beside her and slept. She sat beside Emmett in the rocking chair and rested her head against his shoulder. "Can I tell you something that isn't a story?" she asked. "Always. I'm scared I'll never catch up, that I waited too long." He kissed the top of her head. "You're not behind," he said. "You're just on your own road." She closed her eyes. "And where's it going?" He pulled her closer. "Here, it's going here." Later, Emmett found her notebook left open on the table. She had written one sentence, wobbly but clear. "I see you." Spring came early that year. The snow vanished like it had somewhere better to be, and wildflowers pushed through the cold ground like children waking from a long sleep. The hills behind the ranch turned green at the edges. Birds returned to the porch rail, and even the old mare lifted her head more often, ears twitching at every sound. Inside the house, light poured through the newly washed windows. The curtains fluttered with the wind. On the kitchen table sat a letter, folded, sealed, and heavy with meaning. It was addressed to Emmett Coulter, and it had been written by Tessie May. She'd worked on it every day for 3 weeks, one line at a time. First on scrap paper, Then on clean sheets Miss Adeline had mailed her. She practiced the loops of her letters, the way a heart opens, the difference between there and there, between dear and fear. She rewrote it 10 times, cried over it twice, laughed once when she realized she'd spelled chicken with 3 Ks. But this final draft, this one was her. Emmett came in from the pasture, dust clinging to his boots, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He saw the letter sitting there, like it had been waiting. He looked at her. "You wrote it?" "I did," she said, cheeks pink. "Can I read it?" She smiled. "Only if you read it slow." He picked it up with both hands like it might break, unfolded it, and read, "Dear Emmett, I never knew how many words were locked inside me until I learned the keys. You gave me that. You gave me more than that. This letter isn't just a note, it's proof that I stayed, that I tried, that I grew, and that I saw you. Not just the man with dirt on his hands and silence in his throat, but the man who stood by me when he didn't have to, who read when I couldn't, who listened when I couldn't speak. You've always been stronger than you knew, but now you don't have to carry it alone. You're not just my husband, you're my home, yours, without ink, without letters, without fear, Tessie." When he finished, his eyes burned. He folded the paper carefully and set it down. Then he crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her into his arms. "You're my home too," he whispered. "Always were." She didn't answer, just leaned into his chest and breathed. That night, the lantern stayed dark a while. They sat on the porch, the sky fading to blue-black, the stars opening above them like old wounds finally healed. Tessie's head rested on Emmett's shoulder. The horses huffed gently in the barn. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote howled, and Emmett said, "Tell me a story." She smiled against his shirt. "What kind of story?" "One where everything turned out the way it should." She thought for a long moment, then whispered, "There was a woman who couldn't read and a man who couldn't speak. Not with words, anyway. But they found each other, and slowly they made a language of their own, one of gestures and glances, of fence posts mended and letters rewritten, one of touch, one of time, one of truth." He nodded. "I like that one," he said. Tessie looked up. "It's not finished yet," she said. "Good," he replied, kissing her forehead. "Then keep telling it, every day." The next morning they sat on the porch again. This time Tessie was the one holding the primer. She read aloud from the final page, slow but sure. "Love is not what we say, it is what we stay for." She looked at Emmett. He smiled. "You stayed. So did you." That Sunday the children came back. They crowded the porch as always, but this time Emmett pulled up a chair and sat beside her. He brought out a chair, sat beside Tessie, and when she began to speak, he added the ending. And they lived, not perfectly, not quietly, but fully and together. Some people learn from books, others from life. But the deepest kind of learning comes through listening. Tessie couldn't read the ink on a page, but she could read the quiet. She could hear what people meant, even when they didn't speak. She knew how a horse shifted its weight when it trusted you, how a child's silence held more than words ever could, how a man like Emmett could bury his feelings so deep he forgot they were even there. And Emmett? He thought he needed a woman who matched the words on a page, but what he found was something richer. A woman who saw straight into him, who didn't need letters to tell him she cared. She showed it in every small gesture, every moment she stayed, every story she told. They didn't fix each other. They didn't change to fit some perfect mold. They listened, they softened. They built something word by word, without needing all the words. Maybe Tessie never wrote long letters, but she gave Emmett something better. A love you could hear without ever speaking. And in the end, some of the most powerful stories don't live in ink. They live in the space between two people who finally learned to listen. The letter had promised everything. A man with steady hands, a home tucked into a hillside, 7 chickens for fresh eggs, and enough food for more than one. It even said, "You'll be met at the station. Look for the hat with the red feather." So Charlotte Hayes stepped off the train at Dusty Hollow with 2 worn trunks and a heart still folded around the hope of being chosen. But no man waited. No hat, no horse, just wind, dust, and a barefoot boy with a solemn stare. "You Charlotte Hayes?" he asked. Her voice cracked. "I am." The boy nodded. "Elias is dead. Snake bite. Buried him 2 days ago. I'm Liam." The words struck harder than the wind. "I came to marry him," she said softly. "Yeah. He knew he wouldn't make it. Wrote you anyway. Said maybe you'd still come." She blinked fast, fighting the ache. "How many of you are there?" "There were 7 of us. Then Jenny died last winter. The baby's still nursing. So now it's 6. The train hissed behind her. Charlotte didn't turn. She said, "Show me the house," and followed the boy into the quiet, where something waiting to be loved had already begun to mend. Liam didn't speak much as they walked, just pointed once over the ridge. "That way." Charlotte followed, one trunk in her grip, the other bouncing awkwardly behind him in the boy's calloused hands. The path wound through dry grass and narrow trees, the kind that whispered but never shaded. Every step she took away from the depot felt like shedding a layer of expectation, of identity, of escape. The house appeared suddenly, small, sagging, weathered raw. The porch leaned sideways like it was tired of waiting for something that never came. "That's it," Liam said, setting the trunk down with a grunt. Charlotte climbed the steps slowly. The door creaked open before she touched it. Inside, it smelled of ash and boiled beans. A wood stove crackled in the corner. A baby slept in a crate near the hearth, wrapped in a quilt patched so many times it looked more thread than cloth. Around the table sat 5 children, hollow-eyed and silent, bowls already set, as if supper was something they still believed in. No one smiled. No one spoke. Liam motioned toward the chair at the head of the table. "That was Elias's." Charlotte stood still, then said gently, "Then it stays empty." He nodded once and stepped aside. A girl rose from the bench, braids messy, cheeks streaked in dust. "I'm Maggie," she said. "I stir things. Mama used to. Before Jonah." Her voice was too calm for her age, her eyes too wide. Charlotte approached the pot. Thin broth, 2 beans, a single stubborn potato sliced too far. "You cook this?" Maggie nodded. "When we can," she added. Charlotte set her satchel down, unbuckled the flap. Inside, she pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle, a pinch of salt, dried herbs, and a finger-length piece of smoked pork she'd hidden from a greedy conductor back in Kansas. She rolled up her sleeves. "Let's start again." She added water, crushed the herbs, dropped the pork. The smell changed instantly, went from despair to something like hope. The silence behind her shifted. The smallest boy leaned forward. Even the baby stirred. When it was ready, Charlotte ladled into chipped bowls, some cracked, one nearly broken, and handed each out without a word. "Eat slow," she said. "Let your stomach remember it." They obeyed, heads bowed like prayer. No one asked for seconds, but Maggie blinked fast and one of the boys mouthed "thank you" without sound. Charlotte didn't sit. Her own belly ached, but she leaned against the doorframe and let the hunger be hers alone. This meal wasn't for sharing. It was for claiming them, quietly, one spoonful at a time. Afterward, they cleaned up in a rusted tin basin outside. The water was near freezing, but no one complained. Inside, Liam remained at the table, sitting in the empty chair. Charlotte didn't ask why, didn't need to. Instead, she stepped out to the porch. The sky was turning. Stars blinked like they weren't sure if they were allowed out yet. She sat on the top step, arms around her knees, trying to remember why she ever thought she needed a husband to feel whole. Liam joined her a minute later. "You came," he said, voice barely louder than the breeze. "I did. You could have left. I still could, but you won't." She didn't answer. Instead, they sat like that for a long while. Woman and boy, not family, not strangers, not yet anything, but breathing the same quiet. Inside, the baby fussed once, then stilled. And in that thin silence, Charlotte realized what she'd truly walked into. Not just a house, not just a grave someone forgot to warn her about, but a promise left behind, one that had nothing to do with rings or roofs, and everything to do with staying. The house didn't sleep. It simply held its breath. Charlotte woke before sunrise, though it felt like she'd barely closed her eyes. The floor creaked under her step, and the air smelled like cold ash and something older, like dust that remembered too much. She tiptoed past the baby's crate, past the children bundled in blankets, and knelt beside the hearth to stoke the fire. Her hand brushed something odd beneath the floor's edge, an uneven plank warped at the corner. She lifted it. Beneath, tucked in a sack of forgotten oats, sat a thin ledger bound in frayed fabric. The cloth was soft, ivory once, now stained to the color of grief. Charlotte hesitated, then opened it. Birth dates, names, sicknesses recorded like harvests. Maggie, 1879. Sam, 1883. Jonah, 1886. Jenny, lost to fever, winter 89. At the very end, in a trembling, final hand, Charlotte Hayes arrives June 3rd. She is to be treated kindly. She has nothing. We'll give her everything we've got. Charlotte's breath caught. He'd known. Even with death crawling up his leg, Elias Walker had written her into the story. Not as a stranger, not as property, as part of the plan. She closed the book gently and returned it to its place, beneath wood and ash and memory. The children stirred slowly. Maggie was first. She rubbed her eyes, looked at the hearth, then at Charlotte, who now stirred oatmeal in the pot. "You're still here," Maggie said. "I am." The girl blinked like she wasn't sure if it was relief or confusion that settled behind her ribs. "Most folks leave when it gets quiet." Charlotte ladled thick porridge into bowls and set them gently on the table. "Then let's keep it noisy." Maggie's lip curled upward. Not a smile, not yet, but close. By mid-morning, the house was buzzing. The baby, Noah, as Charlotte had learned, was fussing again, gums red and hands clenched. Maggie held him steady while Charlotte checked the kitchen shelves. 2 jars of flour, 1 of salt, a single onion that had started to grow its own roots in the dark. Liam stood near the door, silent. "You should be playing," Charlotte said gently. "I should be making sure we eat." She turned, wiped her hands. "You're 10, Liam. You shouldn't be the one holding this house together." He didn't argue, just looked down at the floor. She stepped forward. "I didn't come here to be waited on. I came because someone asked me to, and I stayed because I saw why." That's when they heard it. Hooves, steady and deliberate, coming up the ridge. Liam's head snapped up. Charlotte crossed to the window. A tall man dismounted from a pale horse. His coat was dust-caked, his shoulders square beneath it. He carried a leather satchel slung across one arm. Charlotte stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. The man removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "can I help you?" "I'm looking for Elias Walker." Charlotte's voice didn't waver. "He's gone. Snakebite. 2 weeks now." The man nodded, jaw tight. "That's what I feared." Liam came up beside her. "Elias never said he had kin." The man gave a sad sort of smile. "That sounds like him." Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "And you are?" "Warren Briggs. His brother." They sat on the porch. The children hovered inside, watching through gaps in the slats. Harlan set the satchel between his boots and pulled out a second ledger, nearly identical to the one Charlotte had found. "He wrote me letters," he said. "Every month. I never answered. Thought I'd missed my chance until the last one came. Said he was sending for someone named Charlotte Hayes. Not for himself, but for the children. Said he'd rather they grow up with a heart in the house than just a roof." He handed her a folded page. Charlotte recognized the handwriting instantly. Elias's. "If I die before she arrives, let her keep the house. Let her raise them if she chooses. If she doesn't, bury this letter with me and forgive me for hoping." Her hands didn't tremble. "I'm staying," she said. Harlan nodded. "Then I have something for you." He pulled a small iron key from the satchel. "Safe under the floorboards. He meant it for you. Said it's not much, just the last eggs he ever saved." Charlotte accepted it without a word. The weight of it in her apron pocket felt heavier than coin. It felt like someone had believed in her before she ever stepped off that train. That night, she sat by the fire with the ledger on her lap and the key resting in her palm. She hadn't earned these children. Not yet. But she had earned her place. Not through marriage. Through staying. Through rolling up her sleeves and putting supper on a table that once belonged to ghosts. The smoke came just after dawn. Not from their chimney, it was too early for baking, and the fire hadn't yet been stirred. But from the East Ridge, where no one lived and no one should have been. It rose in a thin gray column, steady as a spine, and hung too long in the morning air. Charlotte stood on the porch, water pail in hand, watching it. Cold wind nipped her cheeks, but it wasn't the chill that made her skin tighten. It was the knowing. Someone was out there. She didn't call the children, not yet. Inside, they were chasing one another between the table and the hearth, their feet bare on worn floorboards, their voices bright with the kind of laughter she hadn't heard since her arrival. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them have this moment before the world reminds them what it can take. But Liam saw it too. He returned from chopping kindling with his arms full and his eyes narrowed. "That's not chimney smoke," he said. "It's too dark, too still." She nodded once. "How often does someone ride through here?" "Hardly ever. Not unless they're looking for something. Or someone." That quiet between them was louder than any wind. That night, Charlotte boiled the stew longer. Maggie cradled Noah close while peeling potatoes with silent precision. The boys, too young to name the unease, still picked up on it. No one spilled oats this time. No one teased. After the children were tucked into quilts, Charlotte stepped onto the porch. Shawl wrapped tight, rifle unloaded, mostly ornamental, leaning by the door. Liam followed without being asked. "You think it's someone come for the land?" he asked. "Maybe. Or for you." She didn't flinch. "Doesn't matter which. Either way, they'll find me standing." Liam glanced over. "You don't look like a fighter." Charlotte's mouth twitched. "That's what makes it work." Just before midnight, movement flickered between the pines. A man, mounted. Too tall to be a boy, too still to be innocent. He didn't ride closer, just watched, then vanished behind the ridge again, leaving nothing but the sharp scent of cold smoke lingering on the wind. Charlotte stayed up, eyes fixed on the trees. She didn't sleep. Instead, she wrote. By candlelight, in the corner of the room where the children couldn't see, she tore a page from the back of the ledger and wrote a letter. Not to anyone, not even to God, just to the wind, the walls, the silence. If I fall, let them say I came with nothing in my pockets and still built something worth defending. She folded the paper and placed it beneath the jar of buttons on the mantel. Then she checked the latch on the front door again. And again. By morning, the smoke was gone, but so were two hens, and the woodpile bore prints that weren't theirs. Boots, wide and deliberate, like someone had circled first and chosen not to knock. Charlotte didn't say a word. Instead, she made tea, lit the fire, and began peeling the rest of the potatoes. The children gathered around her as she worked. Jonah tugged her apron. Maggie offered to sweep. Liam stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching every tree beyond the fence line. In her apron pocket, Charlotte ran her thumb over the broken barn latch she'd found lying in the grass. And she thought not with fear, but with fire. There are men who don't like when women build something without permission. But that porch, those boots by the door, those children now seated with warm cheeks and full bellies. This was hers now, and permission was no longer something she'd wait for. It began with a cough, sharp, dry, and far too deep for a child so small. Jonah clung to Charlotte's skirt at breakfast, face flushed, hands shaking as he struggled to lift his spoon. He didn't cry. He just blinked slowly, like the weight of sickness had already begun pulling him under. By noon, Maggie had gone quiet, her eyes glassy, her usual sharpness dulled. The boys didn't chase one another through the grass that day. Noah whimpered until his throat gave out and fell into a terrifying silence. Charlotte knew what was coming. She'd seen it once, back in a mining camp outside of Junction Creek, a fever that spread like a secret, quick and vicious. It didn't knock. It simply arrived. She moved fast, boiled water, stripped beds, hung linens in the wind. Every window was cracked open, every pot scrubbed clean. She crushed pine needles and willow bark into bitter tea and forced it past parched lips that barely had the strength to swallow. Liam hovered beside her, pale, silent, refusing to rest. It's just winter's tale, he muttered, voice tight. Charlotte looked up from a pot of broth, eyes rimmed red. Don't lie to them, or to yourself. That night, 4 of the children burned with fever. Charlotte sat by the hearth with a wet cloth in one hand and a ladle in the other, rocking between beds like a ghost from room to room. Her voice cracked from singing, but she kept going. Half lullabies, half prayer. When the baby stopped crying altogether, she nearly dropped to her knees. No noise, no fight, just a stillness that hollowed her to the bone. She held Noah tight to her chest, felt the faint flutter of his ribs, and rocked him with the desperation of a woman bargaining with something that never listened. Warren Briggs returned the next morning. He hadn't planned to, just a delivery of firewood and dried apples from a widow down the ridge. But the moment he saw the house, he dismounted without a word. Charlotte was barefoot, hair damp, sleeves rolled past her elbows. She didn't flinch when he stepped through the door. "They're burning," she said, voice dull with exhaustion. "I've done all I know. If the fever breaks wrong—" Warren said nothing. He didn't offer comfort. He offered help. Together, they worked, Charlotte crushing herbs while Warren built a steam tent from quilts and iron pots. He knew the old ways, the frontier ways, the ones born not from books, but from survival. Maggie thrashed in her sleep. Jonah cried without sound. The baby wouldn't take milk, and Liam, still standing, collapsed that afternoon without warning. Charlotte caught him as he fell, knees hitting the floor. His skin was blazing. "You stayed," he whispered, eyes barely open. "There was never a day I wouldn't," she said, brushing the hair from his forehead. That night the cabin became something else. A battlefield, a chapel, a womb. She poured broth past trembling lips, sang when her voice cracked, and wept only once, when she thought no one could see. But Maggie did. Half-conscious, fevered, the girl murmured, "Don't leave us." "I won't," Charlotte promised, "even if it takes everything I've got." On the fourth night, she dropped to her knees beside the fire. Her hands blistered, her throat raw. She folded her fingers and whispered not to God. She didn't know if she believed in God, but to whatever force had brought her here. Take anything, but not them. The fire, which had nearly gone out, flared. A single spark leapt high and caught the edge of the kettle like it had hurt her. At dawn, the house was quiet. Not death quiet, healing quiet. Jonah opened his eyes and asked for bread. Maggie stirred and rolled toward the wall. Noah whimpered, just once, but it was a sound, a start. Charlotte sat on the floor in the middle of it all, surrounded by quilts and cold basins, and let out a breath that felt like it had been held for days. Warren brought her tea. She didn't speak, just took it with both hands and let the heat remind her that she was still alive. By noon, the children slept, not with fear, but rest. Charlotte walked outside, feet dragging, apron stained with sweat and herbs. The wind was light, the sky the clearest blue she'd seen since her arrival. Warren leaned against the porch rail, hat in hand. "You did it," he said. "We did," he nodded. Then after a pause, "You should know. Word's starting to spread." Charlotte turned her head. "What kind of word?" "The kind that draws attention. A woman shows up, claims a dead man's house, raises his children, defends it from riders, then beats fever. That kind." Charlotte didn't answer. She sat beside him, staring at the yard. "I never thought I'd be the kind of person people told stories about," she said finally. Warren gave a soft grunt. "You're not a story, Charlotte. You're the reason it didn't end here." That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't sleep on the rocker or near the hearth. She climbed into the bed, Elias's bed, and lay with the baby on her chest. Jonah curled beside her, Maggie's fingers tangled in the hem of her sleeve. She was not their mother, but they no longer trembled when she touched them. And in the dark, in that fragile, earned silence, she understood something deep and final. They had given her a name no marriage could, one that couldn't be written on paper. Mother, not claimed, not forced, not inherited, given freely. And she had taken it with blistered hands, in a heart that had arrived with nothing in its pockets but the will to stay. The snow had only just begun to melt when the riders came. Two men on glossy bay horses crested the ridge like they owned it. Their coats were too fine for farming, their boots too clean for work, and when they stopped at the gate, neither tipped his hat. Liam spotted them first. He was stacking firewood with his sleeves rolled high and sweat on his brow. He dropped the log in his hands and stepped toward the house. quiet but fast. "Charlotte," he called, "you'd better come out." She did, apron still dusted with flour, hands damp from washing dishes, hair pinned up but loose from the long day. The taller man swung off his horse first. He carried himself like a man who'd never been told no. "We heard the bride showed up," he said, eyes scanning her like she was livestock. "I did," Charlotte replied, stepping off the porch. "You are?" "Mr. Carlyle, this here's Deputy Allen. We're here on behalf of the county." The second man unfolded a paper with a red wax seal and held it like a badge. "These children, according to record, are unclaimed. Their guardians deceased. And you, Miss Hayes, have no legal standing in this house." Charlotte didn't blink. "I have a letter, a deed in his handwriting, witnesses." Carlyle smirked. "That might impress a preacher, but the county's got different standards. This land was in debt. That deed doesn't hold if the man who wrote it owed more than he owned." "You're here to take the children?" "Not take," Allen said, as if that softened it. "Reassign, proper placement, homes that can legally support them. Not this." Behind her, the door creaked open. Liam stepped out first, rifle in hand. Unloaded but steady. Maggie followed barefoot, arms crossed tight. The other children were shadows in the windows, watching. "We're not going anywhere," Liam said. "She's our family now." "That's not your decision," Carlyle snapped. "Then whose is it?" Maggie asked, chin high. "Because we know whose it used to be, and she's the one who stayed when no one else did." Charlotte raised a hand, resting it on both their shoulders. "You'll do no taking today," she said, voice even but full. "This house may not have a name carved in stone, but it was built by hands that bled for it. These children aren't wards. They're warriors. And this home didn't come to me through law. It came through need." Carlyle stepped forward, chest puffed. But that's when Warren appeared. He came from the barn's far side, a shotgun resting loose over one arm, like it was part of him. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The stillness around him carried the weight of someone who'd seen worse and wasn't afraid to do what was needed. Carlyle paused, cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered, "we'll be taking this up with the judge then." "You do that," Warren said, his voice like gravel. "And next time, bring more than paper." The men backed away, muttering something about signatures and courtrooms, their retreat more dust than presence. Charlotte turned to Liam, who still hadn't lowered the rifle. "You stood for me," she said quietly. He nodded. "You stood for us first." And in that breath, the shift was complete. She was no longer the woman who stepped off a train into silence. She was the wall between what was and what would never be again. That night, the house held stillness like a shared breath. Charlotte sat by the fire, sewing a new patch into Jonah's quilt. The thread caught on a splinter in the fabric, and she smiled, not out of frustration, but memory. Her hands no longer trembled. Her stitches no longer guessed. They knew where to land. Ruth leaned against her shoulder. Noah slept beside her. Maggie swept crumbs from the floor without being asked. And Liam read aloud from one of the books the preacher had sent, his voice quiet but firm. Outside, snow still clung to the edges of the trees, but inside it was warm. In the weeks that followed, no more men came. But people did. A neighbor with a bushel of apples. A widow offering extra thread. Even the pastor, once skeptical, now stopped by with more books and a note that simply read, "You've done what most of us only pray for." Still, the most unexpected visitor came in early April. A girl no older than 16, barefoot, holding a baby of her own. Her dress was threadbare, her cheeks chapped from wind, her eyes hollow with the same lost look Charlotte had once worn at Dry Hollow Station. She didn't speak, just stood at the gate. Liam saw her first and called Charlotte. Charlotte stepped outside, took one look, and opened the door wide. "You're not late," she whispered, wrapping the girl in a quilt. "You're right on time." That night, as the fire burned low and the house held quiet peace, Charlotte sat beside the girl. Her name was Cora, her baby sick but breathing, and whispered the same words she had once needed herself. "You're not here to be saved. You're here to remember what it feels like to matter." That night she cried. Then she stayed by the hearth until dawn. Spring came slow. The snow melted in uneven patches, revealing muddy footprints, frost-bitten grass, and the corners of a yard that had finally begun to hold warmth again. Cora Dawson had now been with them for just over a month. She spoke little, moved like she was still waiting to be sent away. But each day she stayed longer at the table, held her baby tighter, took up space like she was relearning how. One morning Charlotte found her folding laundry with practiced hands, her baby strapped to her chest with a shawl that had once belonged to Ruth's mother. "You ever sewn before?" Charlotte asked gently. Cora nodded. "Used to hem shirts at the tavern." Charlotte paused. "They treat you bad?" Cora didn't meet her eyes. "They didn't treat me at all. Just used what I brought in." The silence stretched. Then Charlotte said softly, "Well, here, we don't take what isn't offered." Cora looked up then. Her lip trembled, but she didn't cry. "I don't got much left to offer," she whispered. "You brought your child through the cold," Charlotte said. "That's more than most ever do." That day, Cora stayed longer at the fire. The next morning, she helped with breakfast. By mid-April, the porch had been swept so many times it had started to shine. Chickens scratched near a crooked gate. A swing hung from a bent beam, tied with rope Liam had salvaged from the barn. And the laughter, real, daily, unapologetic, was back. Not whispers, not borrowed joy. Their own. Charlotte stood at the window, apron tied tight, watching the younger children tumble through grass, while Maggie showed Cora how to thread a bone needle without splitting the fabric. Ruth hummed as she carried Noah from room to room. Liam dug near the edge of the yard, planting beans where his father once dreamed of a henhouse. The ledger sat on the mantel, open, its last page still blank. Charlotte had never been someone who finished things. But this patched-up life, these children, this firelit shelter, it deserved completion. She dipped her pen, and in careful, slow strokes, she wrote, "Charlotte Hayes Walker, head of household mother, by heart, if not by law word, kept traveling through Dusty Hollow." Some said she was a widow. Others swore she'd married a ghost. But no one questioned her place anymore. Not after the fever, not after the standoff, not after the spring bloom. The preacher came one Sunday morning to bless the land. He brought no Bible, only a tin of wildflower seeds and quiet respect. A neighbor left 3 sacks of flour by the gate. Even the cranky old school teacher from town sent a note offering slates and chalk for the children. "If you're schooling them, I want to help." And then, in early May, they returned. The same 2 men from the county, Carlisle and Allen, rode up, boots polished, mouths tight. This time they came with fresh papers. They didn't knock. They didn't need to. Ruth opened the door before they reached it. She stood barefoot, arms crossed, the rifle leaning by the doorframe like punctuation. "We've got what you're looking for," she said. Carlisle raised a brow. "We've got a judge's order now." "And we've got a mother," Ruth replied, eyes unblinking. A long pause. Allen cleared his throat. "It's official business." "Then take it to town," Ruth said, "because this land answers to what's been built on it, not who stamped what." They hesitated, glanced toward the porch. Warren stood there, sharpening a blade he didn't stop turning. He didn't raise his eyes. He didn't need to. The men turned, papers still sealed. They left without opening their satchel. By the time spring fully settled, the garden had taken root. Liam's tomatoes pushed through the soil. Maggie kept the pantry in order with quiet authority. Cora no longer asked if she could help. She just did. The younger ones began calling Charlotte Mama without flinching, not as a test, as a truth. And Charlotte, she never remarried, never left the ridge, never put away Elias's letter or the jar of mismatched buttons she kept by the mantel. But she did write one final letter. She folded it carefully, slipped it into the back of the ledger, just below her own name. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but it was meant for everyone. If you find this house, know that no one here was born lucky. But each of us chose to stay, chose to love, chose to build, even with nothing. So if you're lost or unsure whether the world still holds people who won't let go come in, there's soup on the fire, a bed in the corner, and someone waiting to tell you you matter. Years passed. More children came. Some stayed. Others moved on. But the porch grew wider. The windows were always warm. And the fire never went out. No one asked anymore who the mother was. They already knew. Charlotte Walker. She hadn't been chosen. She had chosen. And in doing so, she gave them something the world had nearly forgotten how to offer: a home. Some women arrive with nothing in their pockets, no gold, no title, not even a name anyone remembers. But they build anyway, with their hands, with their voice. With the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. If Charlotte Walker's story spoke to you, if you've ever known what it means to carry others through silence, storm, and sickness, then you know motherhood isn't always born. Sometimes it's built. Tell us in the comments, which moment hit you hardest? Was it when Charlotte stood her ground? When Ruth faced the men at the door? Or when the baby said mama for the first time? And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from. Whether it's a snowy mountain town or a quiet prairie porch, your voice matters here. If you believe home is made of more than walls, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who still believes in second chances. And never forget, the fire never went out, because someone just like Charlotte kept feeding it.